wisdom, and education. In this video, I'd like to spend some time exploring the nature of wisdom and its relation to education. There are two main reasons why I want to do that. First, it seems to me that wisdom, or the lack thereof, is at the root of practically every major world problem we're facing today. At the same time, we frequently look to education to be a force that can help us address and solve our problems, at least over the long haul. And so, it seems worthwhile to examine the institution of education and its relation to wisdom. However, before doing that, it's probably good to take a minute to talk about what I mean by wisdom, especially since the word can mean different things to different people. To me, wisdom has to do first with our ability to discern what life is really showing us, and then our capacity to respond harmoniously and skillfully. The important point here is that wisdom is something lived rather than something abstract and intellectual. In other words, wisdom is not a mere product of our knowledge or even our intelligence. Rather, wisdom is something that we make real or fail to make real in the concrete moments of our lives. Consequently, sometimes people can be amazingly knowledgeable and intelligent, and yet exceedingly unwise. Conversely, sometimes people can be very unintelligent and yet surpassingly wise. And because wisdom is something lived, it's not something that we can acquire and then permanently possess, like a new car or a new pair of shoes, for instance. Rather, wisdom is a way of life, a way of moving from moment to moment that is reborn in us with each new living experience. Consequently, wisdom is not really so much a goal to be attained in our lives, but a cumulative byproduct of living well over time. Something that happens to us, almost by accident, while we're dealing with life's exigencies. Okay, now that we've characterized wisdom in rough and approximate terms, let's take a look at our world's major problems. In my view, our world's major problems pretty much all belong to one of three basic types. 1. Problems relating well to ourselves. 2. Problems relating well to each other. And 3. Problems relating well to the world more generally. Problems relating well to ourselves would include phenomena like self-sabotage, fear of success, addictions of various sorts, self-mutilation, our current epidemic of obesity, as well as much of the broad terrain of clinical psychopathology. Problems relating well to each other would range from everyday rudeness and inconsiderateness through racism and ethnicism, religious intolerance and violence, all the way to full-scale war and genocide. Finally, problems relating well to the world would include phenomena like the ongoing destruction of the natural environment, the mass extermination of other species, and our inadvertently having wired the entire planet for instantaneous nuclear obliteration. Oops! And it seems to me that the common thread that runs through all of these three categories is our lack of basic wisdom, our inability first to perceive life's demands and realities well, and then to respond to them in a fruitful, harmonious way. Don't believe me that wisdom is actually the missing ingredient here? Well, try this little thought experiment for a second. Imagine what life would look like if the human race were to become genuinely wise at some point. Yeah, I know it's a stretch, but hang with me. At that point, how many of our self-centered, self-destructive, addictive, little narcissistic habits do you think would still be there? How eager would we still be to enslave, oppress, and annihilate our fellow human beings? And how would we treat the world and other species? Would we still treat them either as resources to be consumed according to our desires, or as worthless trash to be disposed of? Or, if we were really wise, would we be more inclined to honor them as something sacred, as something beautiful and noble, quite apart from whether they're serving our interests or not? Personally, my own view is that a little wisdom would go a long way toward solving practically all of these kinds of major world problems, mostly because, at the end of the day, we ourselves generate practically all of them. When it comes down to it, we're really our own worst enemies. And wisdom has to do with letting go of that nasty little proclivity. But if this is so, then perhaps it would be a good idea to examine what's getting in our way, what the principal impediments to wisdom are. In my view, probably the single biggest impediment to greater wisdom is the very common idea that we already know what we're doing, that we're already wise enough, that we don't really need to question how things are going too seriously. Basically, as with so many classical tragic protagonists, our hubris is our undoing, and it's the main thing that's keeping us from becoming wise. But why is hubris such a powerful and persistent force in human affairs? Part of this probably has to do with the pleasurable enticements of egoism. After all, it just plain feels good to assume that we already know what we're doing. And at the same time, it can be pretty scary and dispiriting when we have to admit that we don't really know what life is about. And so, usually we cling pretty tenaciously and desperately to our already existing perspectives and way of life. But the problem here is that wisdom, the thing that our world so desperately needs right now, is rarely born when we're lounging easily in our comfort zones and avoiding challenging questions. Wisdom is much more often born in our shadows, in the unsettling twilight where daybreak meets the infinite night, in those disconcerting moments when we somehow summon the courage to face what's uncertain and elusive and mysterious about life. In other words, hubris is a powerful force in our lives mostly because wisdom requires actual courage. Wisdom is about opening ourselves and becoming vulnerable to what life actually is. It's about really questioning things in a deep and terrifying and passionate way and learning to love the questions themselves in the process. In the Aeneid, Virgil famously proclaimed that fortune favors the bold. And I sense that the same is true of wisdom. So, as I said earlier, my own view is that the biggest single impediment to our greater wisdom is our hubris and complacency, which are driven mostly by a combination of our egoism and insecurity, together with our lack of courage when it comes to seeking out the real depth of life. And that's what most of our major problems are really about. And it plays out in many areas of our collective and individual lives. In the political and economic spheres, as well as in the domain of our prevailing cultural habits and values, to say nothing of our more immediate interpersonal relationships. However, like I said in the beginning of this video, I'd like to focus on the institution of education. Part of why I want to do that is because that's where I've been working for almost 25 years now, so I feel like I have some first-hand insight into it. Beyond this, though, it seems to me that we often look to education for hope, and especially for the hope that someday we might eventually overcome our pressing maladies and pathologies. However, the immediate problem with this is that the institution of education only rarely takes cultivating and fostering wisdom as one of its principal aims. Much more commonly, it simply fixates on generating and disseminating useful knowledge, especially in the form of saleable job skills. Of course, our fantasy is that if only we had a more knowledgeable and competent population, then we'd be able to tackle our real problems. But my sense is that this line of logic is little more than wishful thinking. That's because our biggest problems are not due to our lack of knowledge per se, but to our inability to live well with what we already know. But the whole issue of how we're actually living with our knowledge only rarely appears under the aegis of today's education. On its better days, education fills us with the wonderment of greater knowledge and competence, which certainly has value in this world. On its worst days, it's just another hoop to jump through, just another exercise in memorizing some tedious mass of bloodless facts, most of which we'll have forgotten in a year or two later anyhow. In other words, a complete counterfeit of genuine learning. But the real problem with education is that it hardly ever teaches us to be fundamentally better human beings, to live wisely, which is actually what our world needs. The hubris of education as we know it, which is really just a reflection of our larger, more pervasive cultural hubris, is that knowledge and intelligence are enough. In this regard, education actually tends to perpetuate our collective difficulties by deflecting our attention away from their actual source, which is why our problems persist decade after decade, irrespective of how many exciting innovations and new technologies we introduce into the pedagogical situation. It's because we've completely misunderstood the deep structure of our problems, along with the essential nature of the kind of education that's supposed to address them. And so, for the most part, we just keep on following the generalized definition of insanity, which is that we keep trying different variations of the same fundamental mistakes, expecting different results. However, at a deeper level of analysis, I've come to sense over the years that the reason why wisdom doesn't appear too often on education's radar is that education as we know it is severely imbalanced in the direction of extrinsic motivation, which is built into its competitive paradigm that revolves largely around test scores and grades. Basically, a Skinnerian paradigm based upon a Weltanschauung of competition for scarce resources. Personally, I believe that there's nothing inherently wrong with competition. In fact, there was a time in my own life when what I really needed to grow was to see how I measured up against other people. And I don't really believe in giving every person on the planet a feel-good trophy, even if it temporarily boosts everyone's self-esteem. After all, what good is boosting someone's self-esteem if it's based upon a lie, or if everyone knows that it's just an empty charade in the first place? Anyhow, the fact is that we often learn a lot, and I mean a lot, about ourselves and about life when we lose the race, when we fall short and have to face disappointment. Because that's exactly when we're really thrown back upon ourselves, when we have to come to grips with our weaknesses and deficits, and find the courage to transcend ourselves and to adapt ourselves better to reality. However, the problem within education is that our chance to cultivate actual wisdom evaporates when the system becomes imbalanced in the direction of excessive extrinsic motivation and competition. When practically everything that counts as learning is based upon competition for grades. The reason is that wisdom doesn't really care how good we are at defeating our competition. Wisdom favors us much more often when we find deep internal reasons to fall in love with the possibilities of learning and knowing things, and when we fall madly in love with life itself in the process. In other words, it's mostly education's intrinsic factors that foster wisdom, not its inordinate emphasis on extrinsically driven competition. Too much emphasis on extrinsic motivation leads to the all-too-common phenomenon where students have passed through months or even years of education and yet seem to know practically nothing at the end of it. It's because they've been obediently jumping through hoops and then deleting their memory buffers at the end of each semester, which is exactly what makes sense if your only reasons for learning are extrinsically driven ones. Basically, it's not enough for us to be teaching our students unthinking obedience to a competitive paradigm. It's not enough for us to teach them merely to live by other people's measures, to think only other people's thoughts, and to conform only to other people's values. Let me say it bluntly. Life really doesn't care how well our students are able to do all of that. What life cares about is whether we can teach them to open their minds, their hearts, and their spirits wide enough to embrace the wide and wild sky of reality, whether we can lead them into the actual depth of life as intelligent, passionate, and ultimately wise human beings. That's what life cares about. Well, at least in my opinion. Of course, the upshot of all of this is that education as we now know it is unlikely to provide much relief from our collective woes. That's because, as I've been arguing, education mostly mirrors and perpetuates our society's overall lack of wisdom, primarily by fixating on knowledge and fostering an obedient, extrinsically driven relation to life. And amazingly, I find that this is something that people, even teachers rarely question. For the most part, we like to bewail education's shortcomings, and we vow to address those problems by trying to get our politicians to funnel more money in education's direction. But our lack of willingness to question the real root of education's structural definition is the real problem, and it's mostly an expression of our hubris, our misguided certainty that we already know what we're doing, at least as far as education's fundamental paradigm goes. And, of course, the self-perpetuating paradox of our hubris is that it would take wisdom to recognize that what we're missing is wisdom. And the result is that, for the most part, education as we know it continues to fail to fulfill its promise of becoming a force that would genuinely help our world's malaise. However, over time, I've also come to see wisdom as a paradoxical thing. The paradox is that the more willfully we try to force it to happen, the more it recedes into the distance. Consequently, there's not much sense in taking wisdom too seriously or turning it into some kind of agenda-driven action item. But I do think that it would help at least to wonder about it, to keep it within the horizon of our awareness and aspirations, and maybe to mention it now and then, perhaps as a kind of joke rather than a rigid, serious project. I feel that this is true in life generally, and true more specifically within the domain of education. Probably the worst thing we could do would be to devise a Wisdom 101 class that would require 10 assignments and 3 tests with a grueling comprehensive final exam at the end of the semester. It would be much better just to keep including wisdom within the range of things that we value, to hold it lightly and loosely within our discursive practices, rather than clinging to it with a willful death grip. But the same is probably true of this video you're watching. So, insofar as I should probably make at least a few helpful prescriptive suggestions, I'd like to make them in the form of a lighthearted joke, and not necessarily even a good joke. So, in that spirit, I'd like to conclude this video by offering up another one of my top 10 lists. This one is Top 10 Indicators of Wisdom, according to Eric Dodson, who probably isn't actually very wise. And it consists of what seem to be markers and signposts along the road of wisdom, at least as I personally encountered it in everyday life. So, without further ado, here it is. Eric Dodson's Top 10 Indicators of Wisdom. Number 10. Kindness, compassion, and generosity, especially for no good reason. It's one thing to embody these attitudes when we expect something in return, but it takes real wisdom to do it out of sheer love for life. Number 9. Appreciation and gratitude. While it takes wisdom to give our gifts freely to others, it also takes wisdom to receive gifts graciously from others. See what happens when you start thanking the people you care about just for being alive in this world. Number 8. Learning to hold things, even precious things, loosely. This doesn't mean completely letting go of everything, but it does mean realizing that everything in this world is ultimately impermanent, including ourselves. Number 7. Balance. As they say, all things in moderation, including moderation. The trick is in knowing when the time is strategically right for excess and when it's not. Number 6. Playfulness, humor, and laughter. Childlike abandon, especially about life itself, is an important part of our human birthright. The universe will not implode if you find it funny. God's omnipotence includes the power of laughter, and God's omniscience means that he, she, it will get your joke. In fact, probably better than you do. Number 5. Spontaneity and creativity. At the end of the day, what life is actually asking us for is to create an experiential meaning for our lives in the infinite, spontaneously flowing river of time and space. See what happens when you start living like that's actually true. Number 4. living with a sense of adventure, verve, and passion. Probably most of us end up spending a lot of our lives just trying to claw our way to the next weekend. Here's an alternative paradigm. Our lives don't actually have to be dull, predictable, and prosaic. Number 3. Curiosity, openness, and a willingness to try what seems impossible. Wise people usually don't seem to be too hung up on narrow, limiting beliefs about themselves and the world. Instead, they're realistically positive about life and eager to explore its further reaches and possibilities. Number 2. The ability to inhabit the present moment fully. Most of us spend a lot of time semi-sleepwalking through our lives. See what happens if you decide you're going to stay awake for more of it. And the number one indicator of wisdom, according to Eric Dodson, is panoramic awareness and holism. I find that it's a wise thing to be willing to experience and honor all that life is, rather than just the parts that I and my friends happen to like. Remember that darkness, disorder, and injustice also have their necessary place in the larger order of things. So, try taking a minute or two each day to relate to the larger totality of life, to feel open, wild, and alive in an incalculably vast, poetic, and terrifying universe. And who knows, maybe if we could feel all of that deeply enough, if we could feel it moving through our very bloodstream, flowing like an endless river of sensation and experience, swollen with the new rain of life itself, well, maybe we might actually start to become wise. Just a little thought. Have a wise day.